Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the March 2023 edition of the Morning Blend. I'm Allison DeFlorio with Exude Human Capital, and so honored on this Women's History Month edition to be joined once again by my friend and colleague, Lori Armstrong-Halber. Morning, Lori.
Woo, good morning.
Woo-hoo! Women. Yeah, you know what? Before we even get started today, we really have to just take a moment and celebrate Women's History Month and all the progress that has been made and all the work that's yet to come. But I thought it was interesting in prepping for this, Lori, I think you'll appreciate this. And I didn't realize that Women's History Month started in 1909 with a group of suffragists in New York City and some others who cared about women's issues, in honor of the one-year anniversary of the International Women's Garment Workers Strike.
Really?
And yes, isn't that so interesting? And they had to hold it on a Sunday so people wouldn't miss work. So my, oh my, 3 years later, it was adopted by 17 countries in Europe with International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, everyone. And then it wasn't until 1987 that that Congress actually designated the entire month of March to celebrate women's history. And it's really to celebrate and honor women's contributions and sacrifices by women for women, as we continue to promote women in our world and to create a safer and fairer world. So with that, welcome to the Morning Blend. Just as a reminder, this is being recorded, so we will send a recording out after the session. Your phones are on mute. However, your questions are important to us. So please feel free to post them, and we will do our best to answer them. And as always, our contact information is at the end. And if we can't address anything today, please feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we'd be happy to do that. Some of you have been with us before, so you know our story and who we are. But for those of you who are new, I'm Allison DeFlorio, co-founder, managing partner of Exude Human Capital. I use the pronoun she, her, and I work with organizations in the areas of human resources, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness, and leadership development. And really, we look at the connectedness of those three areas in working through solutions to support our organizations. I hope to share with you today, as we always do, our experiences in addition to some of the trends and insights that we have based on what we're learning from our clients and what we know from the industry. And with that, I want to turn it over to Lori.
Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to see some of you again, and nice to have you for those of you who are joining us for the first time. I am a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at Fox Rothschild, and I've been practicing exclusively in the area of workplace law for 26, a while. Let's just say that.
Who's counting?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. I'm really excited about our Daily Brew conversation today, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But just by way of background, for those of you who don't know me, in addition to practicing in the area of workplace law, I'm also a mediator with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and an adjunct professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. I got my MBA a couple of years ago, and I sort of echo Allison's comments in that my approach is really to partner with clients, employers, HR folks, managers, to help them be, it's really a holistic approach, because I think if you are giving your employees every opportunity to succeed, you likely don't need me. So my job is to put myself out of a job. And Allison and I created the Morning Blend as an opportunity to give you what you need to know in terms of workplace law, combined with best practices from, again, a more holistic HR approach. And so we welcome you today, and we look forward to our conversation.
And Lori, I believe you are fresh back from a conference, so you really have some fantastic insights. So why don't you kick us off with what's happening in the Daily Brew?
Yeah, so this is the piping hot version, and Allison's not wrong. I literally just got home Saturday. I spent last week at the American Bar Association labor conference, the Developing Labor Law and Practice and Procedures under the National Labor Relations Act. And before your eyes glaze over, I will tell you it's actually a really fabulous conference. The members of the National Labor Relations Board attend. The general counsel from the National Labor Relations Board attends, and top practitioners in workplace law. A lot of us work on the treatise, the developing labor law and things like that. And so the level of discourse is, I was tired when I got home, but lots of really good insight for both union and non-union employers. I know that some of you have probably already called me about, oh gosh, are our settlement agreements, severance agreements impacted by this decision? And so real briefly, the National Labor Relations Act covers, again, both union and non-union employers, in particular under a section called Section 7, which protects employees and allows them to engage in what we call protected concerted activity. And the current board and the current general counsel really focused a lot of their enforcement efforts and their new policy on protecting those rights. So things like confidentiality provisions, which had been under fire in previous administrations, are really getting close scrutiny right now under this board. And this decision came out, and a lot of people were like, uh-oh, because it is an impact on severance agreements and confidentiality agreements. And we had a lot of discussion at the meeting and I should tell you that the meeting attendees are union side, board attorneys, and management side. So there's a lot of debate. We do allow Bloomberg and one or two other reporters to attend the meetings, and there were some sort of interesting quips, but the discussion was pretty great. And the McLaren decision, just so you know, had to deal with the confidentiality provision in a severance agreement. There had been two prior decisions, Baylor University and IGT, which had broadly permitted employers to include confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions in severance agreements. A little bit different than settlement agreements. But the board's new rule says that the, quote, mere proffer of severance that conditions the receipt on benefits on, quote, the forfeiture of statutory rights, meaning the acceptance of overbroad confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions, violates the National Labor Relations Act. So what does that mean for you? Well, you should partner with your labor counsel. You're welcome to call me or anyone else that you work with on such things to take a review of your severance agreements. And to the extent you have sort of the general, you won't disparage us language, and you'll keep the terms and conditions of this agreement confidential, the board will take the position that those are no longer valid and no longer enforceable. The thinking behind it is that things like severance are considered terms and conditions of employment. You can tell I'm struggling with this because I don't agree. Are considered terms and conditions of employment. And even if the exiting employee doesn't have an interest, by preventing that employee from communicating with current employees, that is an infringement on the current employee's Section 7 rights to exchange information about things like compensation, severance, and benefits that they could then use for the purposes of determining whether or not they want to engage in bargaining. Just so you know, for anybody who's rolling their eyes or exasperated or whatever, the management bar collectively was like, yeah, but, and we listed a bunch of reasons why we didn't agree, including that it was an exiting employee and therefore it wasn't their terms and conditions anymore. That's not actually a super strong argument, but I won't get into the technicalities. That it was a voluntary agreement by that employee who has the right to waive their right under Section 7, among other things. So long story short, we didn't win on that. I don't know whether this decision will later be challenged at the district court level. Board decisions sometimes are, but in the meantime, this is where you live, and the board could invalidate those provisions. And where it gets complicated is whether or not that impacts the agreement on as a whole. So, for example, if somebody told somebody, "This is what I got in severance," in violation of your agreement, which includes a unenforceable confidentiality provision, and then you try to recoup the money for breaching the contract, the board would entertain an unfair labor practice charge and then perhaps order you to repay the money that you recouped because the person breached the confidentiality. Anyway, yeah, as you can see, we had a lot of stuff to talk about, but that's the McLaren decision in a nutshell. And so I would urge you to contact your labor and employment counsel. If you don't have one, you can call me. If you don't like me, I'll find somebody you do like, but you should take a look at your severance agreements. Similarly, there has been a lot of decisions and guidance that have come down on uniform policies, electronic surveillance, and Weingarten rates. So if you haven't heard about it, the Tesla decision is kind of a big deal. For those of you who have ever been involved in any sort of union workplace, you might remember that the old adage was an employee can wear a button, but you can otherwise restrict what an employee wears in the work site. And the Tesla decision is a broadening allowance of employees to wear what they want. At Tesla, employees wear different colored shirts based on whatever their assignments are, so that production management can figure out who's doing what, where they should be, et cetera, et cetera. They were supposed to wear black. And some of them came in wearing black t-shirts with union stuff all over the t-shirt. And Tesla said, you can't do that. And that was challenged. And the board said, well, yeah, they can. One of the distinguishing factors was that Tesla would allow them to put on other black sweatshirts that maybe had like a college name or something on it. But be that as it may, it's clearly a broadening of the old adage. And if you have a uniform policy, again, you want to take a look at it. You want to consult with somebody to consider whether or not your policy per se violates the NLRA, and or if you're in an industry, I used to say in an industry that would be, but now every industry might be subject to organizing. And so you might want to be thoughtful about what your strategies are. If your choice is to remain union free, how you want to go about doing that in compliance with things like uniform policies. Similarly, if you use any kind of electronic surveillance, the General Counsel's office has issued a memo and it, again, feels that electronic surveillance, unless narrowly tailored to specific business needs and narrowly tailored in terms of time and scope, are an infringement on Section 7 rights. So, for example, if somebody was driving a truck, you use a video surveillance to make sure that they're driving safely. When they're on break time, the General Counsel's position is, even though it's your truck, that you should not be able to surveil what the employee is doing during break time on the truck, because your interest isn't as great as that person if they happen to be talking to somebody or on the phone or otherwise engaged in some sort of protected activity, union organizing, or other things like talking about terms and conditions of employment with their coworkers. So again, this is another broadening. And lastly, Weingarten is a right that typically, it's gone back and forth a little bit, but Weingarten comes out of a case called Weingarten, where the board determined that an employee who is represented is entitled to have representation in any sort of meeting that might lead to discipline. And so particularly in the union setting, if you're going to counsel an employee or you're going to investigate the employee and that investigation could result in some sort of discipline to that employee has a right to bring a representative of his choice or her choice or their choice with them. Conventional wisdom has been that that's only been in the case in unionized facilities. And the current board says no, that is a Section 7 right again, and that even in non-unionized facilities, somebody has the right to bring a representative with them to an investigatory meeting so that they have somebody, it's not really to represent them, but to be with them. And the board's thinking is that, again, that is an opportunity for concerted protected activity. Again, management bar and myself actually raised this. I said, well, the individual who's maybe subject to discipline is protecting their own rights. I don't see the expansion of Section 7 in this situation. And I disagree with the courts and the board, and the management bar all said, yeah, we agree with Lori. But again, that's the current state of the law. So there is a lot of activity going on at the board level that will impact you, whether you're union or not. And so if you need any assistance with this, you want to look through your policies, you want to just have a discussion, feel free to reach out to me or to your current counsel.
So Lori, just to follow up on that last Weingarten broadening of the rule there. So if an employee today says that they're being addressed, their performance is being addressed, something's being addressed, or infraction of a policy, and they're going to human resources, they have the right to bring somebody with them from within the organization.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. It's not entirely clear whether it's somebody in the organization. I said, what are you telling me? Because I'm never going to allow it, that they can bring their lawyer. And there's apparently a carve out. I'm not quite sure where that carve out comes from, but that the board has not expanded it, that you need to allow them to bring their lawyer. It's also not clear whether you are required to permit the person to talk, meaning the representative.
Oh, understand.
Or whether they're simply that you are required to permit them to attend as a witness.
Okay. So. Interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay. Oh, I just covered all of these.
Oh, we did cover that. All right. So we'll go to this.
Wait, go back one thing real quick.
Oh.
Other way. The one thing I needed was the Thrive case. Those are each of the cases that I was referencing. And in that case, there's a discussion on the board's expansion. So to the extent you're sort of like, well, I'm not really worried about what the NLRB is going to do. It used to be, we used to talk about notice postings. I just have to stick a thing on the wall and I'm not going to worry about it. Because the board feels that these violations are so significant, they have expanded also the damages that they will seek for unfair labor practice charges to include make-whole remedies. So where, for example, if you terminated an employee for violating your uniform policy, even though it's in a non-union setting, if the board determines that it is an unfair labor practice charge that violated the act, they could seek not only back pay and reinstatement, but things like if because of the back pay, they lost their car or they had excessive interest on their credit cards or other damages that the board believes flow from the unlawful loss of employment, the board is going to seek those remedies as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I wish I could fly on the wall at that conference.
So.
Great. So thank you for that. But let's move on to the Daily Brew, and you're going to kick it off with some of the rules and the protections in the workplace for women, and perhaps how they've evolved or what's current with them today.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I do not want to spend a lot of time on all this. I really think the bulk of our conversation, which Allison is going to lead, is far more interesting. But I did want to remind you that there are several federal, state, and local statutes that are relevant to women in the workplace. Obviously, Title VII has a protection against discrimination for being either on the basis of gender, whether gender identity, sexual orientation, or biological gender. Pregnancy Discrimination Act, same sort of thing. Americans with Disabilities Act, I think we're back one slide, yeah.
Sorry.
Relate to situations where an employee has a complication related to pregnancy or you have some other condition that substantially limits you in major life activities. And some of those conditions are more prevalent in women than in men. We're seeing a big spike in discussions under the Age Discrimination Employment Act, partnered with discussions about menopause and the impact on women in the workplace and the sort of shuttling of older women off to the side and the impact that that's having. There are a couple of health-specific acts that have been introduced, laws that have been introduced, the Women's Health Equity Act and the Women's Health Protection Act. And the CDC has also had a statement on women's health. All in all, talking about all different aspects that women face in the workplace, not only their own direct employment, but things like, and you could probably change the slide, parental leave, dealing with caring for aging parents, which is something I'm dealing with right now, being the primary caretaker for children, domestic violence, fertility, breastfeeding, pregnancy, racial and ethnic health inequities as well. All of this, there's a lot of sort of pending legislation in various areas that are attempting to deal with discrimination and other unlawful practices, or what we consider to be or should be unlawful practices related to these categories. And in the government, it's a little bit easier because the executive branch, i.e. President Biden, can order certain initiatives which don't apply in the private sector. And for example, the Department of Defense has an initiative right now that's specifically focused on women's health in the workplace. So there is a lot of stuff going on at the legal level. There are certain statutes and regulations that are currently in effect, but it's a little bit patchwork. And I think you'll see from the discussion, I guess our word of the day is holistic. I think, looking at this holistically is really important.
Yeah, and I just want to call out the pay equity, because, that's something that just still continues to strike me, that women are still, to this day, 85 cents to the dollar of men in similar roles. And if you look at subsets of that, women of color, Latinas, that becomes a bigger gap. And interestingly, with Latinas, the higher the level of the role in leadership, the bigger the gap. So can you talk a little bit about some of the pay transparency laws that have popped up? I think there are 16 or 17 states that have adopted some form of pay transparency.
Yeah, and then I'm going to deviate on a tangent, but it's relevant in a minute. So pay transparency laws are kind of the latest thing. I view. So we often see this when the federal government is not acting quickly enough. States and local governments will go ahead and put into effect their own laws. Some of them, they're a little bit different depending on where you are. So New York's law is pretty got a lot of publicity, the New York ordinance in particular. Mm-hmm. Questions about whether or not these laws apply only to employers in the state. In other words, do you have a presence in the state versus are you seeking employees from the state? Most of them take the position that if you're advertising in those locations and seeking or employees from those locations could be seeking the employment that is posted, you must comply with their pay transparency laws, which means even if you are a Pennsylvania employer, but your posting is reaching people in New York, and New York City requires that you say the range for this job is X to Z, you must include that. The step 2 of this, which I think might get us a little off track that I won't get into, is then the tracking. There's a legislation requiring certain tracking and data gathering, including AI data gathering, so that you can kind of demonstrate that you're moving in the right direction. And that's kind of new and not a lot of clarity around it. The other thing that I wanted to mention, it's not pay equity related, is that there is a lot of discussion about protections for people who are overweight in the workplace. And statistically, women who are overweight, this will not surprise you, suffer more discrimination than men who are overweight. Mm-hmm. Weight in and of itself is not currently a protected class, except in Michigan and I can't remember, maybe Colorado, one other place. Texas is looking at it right now. Although obesity, if associated with a disability, like if you have a disability that is caused by obesity or you're morbidly obese, then perhaps there's protections under the ADA. But again, all of this kind of speaks to some of the challenges women face.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. And as we move through the remainder of, we want to talk a little bit about health insurance and then we'll transition into.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So the Harvard Business Review has, if you search in Google's, it's funny, we still call it Google, even though people use different engines these days. But if you Google the Harvard Business Review and women's health, you will come up with a number of publications and studies that they've done. One of them, they point to 4 particular things that they look for in terms of benefits as employer opportunities to impact women's health. And that, of course, is part of the larger discussion. If you have healthy, engaged women, then that will improve women's ability to participate in the workforce, right? So the four things that the Harvard Business Review points to are health insurance, paid parental leave. I have long said, and Allison knows this, that it is not enough to just focus on women. We have to focus on making things that had traditionally been women's things okay for people who are not women.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we'll always be in this dynamic or this paradigm where it's comparing women to some other bar as opposed to where our bar is good, right?
Right.
Supportive workplace policies, which would include maybe hybrid work, modified work schedules, performance-focused management versus FaceTime management, things like that. And that's also goes with workplace design, not only, in terms of when and where, but also actual physical design in your workplace. Are there opportunities for privacy, for breastfeeding? Do you supply women's related products in the restroom? Those things are all part of being an inclusive work environment.
Mhm. Yeah, and the supportive workplace policies, we're going to talk quite a bit about in the second part of this as something that showed up in as findings and remedies in a report by McKinsey and the group leanin.org. Really interesting report that shed some light on the status of women in the workplace today, and what, most importantly, what employers could be focusing on, which really, as I mentioned, links to what Lori has talked about. So, as we opened this session, we talked about there's been a lot of movement with women, particularly women in the workplace, but there still are many opportunities to continue for employers to continue to focus on how can we make a more equitable, fair, safe environment for women. So let's talk a little bit about what the current state is, and more importantly, what employers are doing about this. So according to this study, and there is a link for the study, I believe, at the end of the presentation, but you can feel free to look it up or reach out to either one of us for it. Women are still, no shocker, underrepresented in leadership. 1 in 4 in the C-suite. You take that to women of color, it's 1 in 20 in the C-suite. And if, Lori, I don't know if you saw it, but probably 2 weeks ago, possibly 3 weeks ago, in the Wall Street Journal, they did an article on CEOs, high-level C-suite women in the technology space who are just exiting, and they highlighted, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 of them, all of whom were replaced by men. And I'm not saying that those men are not qualified to replace them. I'm just saying it's just interesting to see that in some of the largest technology companies. Some of what they attribute this lack of women in leadership to is this conundrum of the broken rung. So if you think of a ladder, that first step on the ladder is that first step into any sort of management role. And the study showed, and the study, by the way, it was 40,000 people participated in it across cross-sector industries, showed that for every 100 men that make it to that first step into management, only 87 women do in general. And then if you looked into the subset, women of color, 82%. If you go into Latinas, Asian American women, the number dropped. So this is a critical component because it perpetuates this issue of not having women in leadership. If they can't get to that first step and have allies to support them, or processes within an organization that develops and supports women making it to that first rung. The other interesting data point, which women are leaving companies at higher rates than men. We've seen over the last 3 years since the pandemic an enormous exodus of both men and women, but still continues to see women leaving at a higher level. And for every woman that is promoted to director or above, 2 director or above women are leaving organizations. So we're not making gains. We're still kind of facing these headwinds that are stronger for women, continue to be stronger for women than are for men. And, almost 30% of women are reporting, considering reducing hours, leaving jobs, or taking less demanding jobs. I think that it's interesting. I had a call with a fantastic female professional yesterday, who will be a guest on our upcoming podcast, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And she had just left a very high profile role simply because she had to make that determination of work-life balance, that it was no longer sustainable. And if she wanted to find the right time for her children, that it wasn't going to work for her to remain in this very high level, predominantly male dominated field. So it's very real. These are numbers on pages, but I would imagine, Lori, you and everyone listening today knows someone who falls into this category of some of the things that we're talking about.
The one of the things that strikes me is that becomes sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Then the men who are sitting in, the traditional male who has sat in a position with a stay-at-home wife and, for whom the traditional system works well, will say, well, see, that just goes to show, whether they verbalize it anymore, which many of them don't. Their unconscious bias is reaffirmed by those choices, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. And it's something that goes on to that. I mean, there are certainly benefits to having, gender diversity in at the highest levels of an organization. The study went on to say that 30% companies with 30% more women in executive roles are 10 to 30% more likely to outperform. And they listed a number of metrics in there, from margin to profitability, et cetera. The other piece that I thought was extremely insightful is that the report showed that companies face not only losing current women leaders, but that next generation, the under 30 group, reported the issues around flexibility. They're as ambitious, if not more ambitious, than today's women leaders. And the kinds of things that women leaders are leaving the workforce today are even more important to that group under 30. So for employers out there who really want to attract and retain women and promote them into leadership, be mindful that this next generation up and coming has higher expectations of their role as leaders. And we'll share some of that with you. The other thing that was interesting, and talked about how women tend to prefer the remote or hybrid work environment because it's conducive to work-life balance. And it also mitigates some of the microaggressions that they typically face. It doesn't eliminate them, but it can mitigate some of the microaggressions. But they call out microaggressions that women face in the workplace. And I think some of these are interesting. And if there are any women listening here, or even any men who've been a witness to some of these kinds of microaggressions, some of the three that they cited that I thought were interesting is having someone say or imply that you're not qualified. And you can see how the percentages change between women of color. And again, if you go into the report, you'll see even greater disparities as you dig into the data deeper. Being mistaken for someone at a lower level. I had to chuckle at this one because this actually happened to me within the last few months on a call. And I just thought it was kind of interesting. It's like, oh yeah, that happens. And having your judgment questioned. And if you look at the number there, 39% of women leaders report having their judgment questioned, and 55% of Black women leaders report having their judgment questioned. So again, if you break into the data, LGBTQ, women with disabilities, Black, Latina, Asian Americans, the numbers become even more astounding. I don't know, Lori, if you've experienced any of this in your world.
Personally, or my clients? Both. I will tell you a story. I kind of wish I had written this book back in the day, but right before Me Too became a thing, I and my then partner, so male partner, and I also partner at the time, were working on a case, and we're sitting in a conference room, and female associate came in and, was sort of shaking her head and relaying how a friend of hers, also a woman, had been mistaken for the court reporter when she showed up at court. And she and I, the associate and I, sort of exchanged a knowing glance, and I sort of chuckled and rolled my eyes because it's such a thing that we just didn't even. It's not that it's okay, but you're just sort of like, ugh, here we go again. And the male partner said, "Oh no, come on, that doesn't really still happen." It was totally, I couldn't believe that it was really still a thing. And I said, I think we should do a study. Let's go out and you ask like 5 people that you know, 5 women that you know, if they've ever experienced either harassment, discrimination, or a microaggression. And I guarantee you, every one of them will have at least one story. And then ask the men. And more likely than not, they won't have anything to relay. And I went into I'm a member of a networking group with like 5,000 women lawyers. And I posited it in the group. Like, how many of you thinking, I'll get some feedback. I had 532 comments in 5 minutes. So
I'm not laughing at that number. I'm not surprised. And I think it's something that, it's interesting. I think we've been in the workforce for some time. You mentioned it, you're used to it. Your colleague mentioned used to it. But I think as women enter the workforce, that may not be, dare I use the language, tolerated, that perhaps women at our generation have tolerated or worked toward, but it's definitely something that's impacting women in the workplace.
Hey, when I teach, last year I was teaching, and most of my students are in their 20s or maybe early 30s. I do have some who, come back to law school later. And I was was teaching the harassment segment. I'm relaying some facts that probably women of a certain age would find boorish, but not abhorrent, right? Same sort of thing. And her reaction was pretty, pretty striking. And I realized that the women that I know who are younger or of Gen or millennials, even younger millennials and Gen Z, have very little patience and do not mind speaking up about anything that they find to be inappropriate. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, we have to have that shift to really have an equitized workforce.
100% agreed. And they were raised by people like us, right? So, I mean, they're probably hearing those stories and that's influenced how they're going to think about it. So, oops, what happened there? So what can employers do? I mean, I think that this is important. The 5 driving factors that the report cited for why women leaders are leaving are opportunities or perceived lack thereof to advance. Flexibility in the workplace, you can see that number is enormously high, 66% reported flexibility. And while employers have done a good job over the last 3 years of creating some flexibility, there's been a push recently as if, the market's shifting, it's starting to the pendulum's kind of swinging here. And more employers are now saying, wait a minute, I think it's time to come back. Let's pull back some of this flexibility. Or they're limiting the flexibility that was given in ways that no longer feels flexible. So for instance, control of the days that you do work from home that don't necessarily impact the business, right? The company commitment to DEI. If you dig into the data, this was very interesting. The data suggested that women and women of color in leadership roles in companies are more likely to take leadership roles in DEIB efforts, but are rarely, and it's an extra part of their job. It's something that they're willing to do. They do it on a voluntary basis, but that it's rarely recognized as part of their performance or their contributions to the overall organization. So I thought that was an interesting piece there. And the unsupportive manager, Laura, you talked about it, having supportive processes in place. This was a big one, feeling as though managers were not, their direct manager or supervisor, again, these are women at leadership level, so that could be pretty high in the organization, was unsupportive of issues impacting them, whether they be microaggressions, opportunities to advance, flexibility, et cetera. And the unmanageable workload. So this came up, and there are some interesting case studies in the report. people working weekend after weekend after weekend, which I think all of us agree, there are going to be times when, if you're in a leadership role, you are working through weekends. That's just a given. I don't think anybody's arguing that. But the question is, if that's happening on a regular basis, is the job structured in such a way that it's manageable for any single person to manage the workload? So that was a pretty high number there, 55% of all women and 68% of others. So what can an employer do to address this? Number one, you've got to think about your flexibility options and guidelines, communicate them often, and leaders need to lead by example, because women leaders are going to, they're going to look to see, any leader, male or female, is generally going to look to see what leaders in the organization are doing. And if leaders are practicing flexibility, then those up and coming leaders will take advantage of flexibility policies and process. Otherwise, they feel as though by doing that, they're showing that they are not worthy of promotions or advancements. One of the suggestions in the report is that employees who can choose their work arrangement are less likely to leave. Now, that may be, choose within options that the employer presents. The perfect option, or the perfect example of this, is days of the week that somebody is going to work remotely, right? Do you mandate Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or do you give the option that someone has to work in the office 2 days a week? Those are the kinds of things that meant a lot to the people responding to this survey. And people, I think I shared this earlier, women reported experiencing fewer microaggressions when working remotely. Now, that's not a solution, but it is interesting, and it's something that we talked about, those headwinds. A microaggression can impact someone's ability to focus for that moment in time. It might impact, depending on the level of the microaggression, it might impact their week or their day. So, or the next conversation that could be with their manager. So giving, there are advantages in addition to microaggressions for flexibility. Lori, I don't know if you want to add anything to that in terms of the legal issues around flexible work environment or hybrid work environments.
So we did a webinar on hybrid work environments and some of the challenges associated with people working from far remote locations that you weren't contemplating, and whether or not you were running afoul, you as the employer then run afoul or have obligations under the laws where that person is being, right? So if I go to Nevada and decide that I'm going to hang out there for 6 months and work remotely, you might have as an employer, you might have some obligations in terms of business use tax and paying taxes and things like that. But kind of bringing it closer to directly what we're talking about, I think there is, again, some unconscious bias at play, particularly where leaders in the organization, and you see this particularly in law firms and other similar, maybe accounting firms and things like that, where there's this, well, you have to be in the office to be doing work. And there's this suspicion that goes with being not, with working remotely. And I think that impacts women disproportionately and younger workers disproportionately. And while it's true that as a matter of law, if your requirements are consistently applied, i.e. everybody has to be in the same number of hours, the same number of days, you will have an impact on aspects of your workforce that in the long run will leave you with less diversity and probably losing talent pool. I think, Allison, my older daughter is actually a recruiter, and she's really struggling because the leaders at her organization are like, we want everybody in the office, even though when she was hired, she was told it was a remote job. And she's like, I can't get people to take these jobs because they don't want to be in the office and they don't want this sort of rigidity. So yeah, there's sort of this legal component about if you do it consistently, you can kind of do what you want. But as a practical matter, just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best practice.
Yeah. Certainly something to think about. The other piece that you can do as an employer is gather feedback regularly, check-ins, surveys, find out what's working for all employees. This is just generally good management, but for women, find out what's working and take action on what you learned. So if you hear that maybe there's opportunity to adjust flexibility, maybe there's opportunity to provide more support for someone's commitment to DEIB, or someone's feeling unsupported, take some action to be able to address that issue. There's always the opportunity to invest in employee connectedness. I think one of the things, Lori, and I don't know how you feel about this, but as employers settle into whatever this next space is for workplace models, I am concerned that those who do have more face time with leaders may be perceived differently, or just may have more connectedness with those leaders and may have more insights into promotions and opportunities than those who are remote. And if we do know that women thrive in the remote or hybrid work environments, might that have an additional impact on women and their ability to be promoted? So I think employers really need to focus on, what are you going to do with your women leaders? How do you stay connected to them? How do you leverage technology, whole team events, make some connective points so people have equal access to FaceTime to other leaders who are making these decisions for organizations? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a little bit of a capitalist. So my thoughts on all of this in general is the market will dictate. And while it's true, I think historically women and people of color have been disadvantaged significantly if they're not in the room where it happens, so to speak. I think you see a trend towards women and other people who are not in the room where it happens by choice, because whatever, they're going out and they're doing their own thing. And some of them are doing it better than where they came from. So, the other shift, it's not directly on point, but I think it's analogous. And I'll talk about law firms again. And I get this perspective both from being a partner in several law firms and also from being a professor. I have watched the demographics of students in my classroom over the past 16 years become far more diverse than they ever were, which means there's far more diversity entering law firms. And law firms talk about diversity. We still generally suck at it. I will say it outright. I don't mean my firm, I mean generally speaking. Although we're getting better. But what's interesting is the people then that are leaving law firms and are going in-house become the clients that select law firms. And they are the ones with the buying power. And you will see a shift then in who they're buying from. And so, some of this is about what type of employer do you want to be. And by the way, I know there are people on this Zoom, and I will tell you that this goes through my head as well. Well, why can't I, as the employer, have certain requirements? I think it is important that we are all in the office because we have the benefit of running into each other and having an exchange that's important. We have the benefit of creating a culture in frankly, an easier way than doing it remotely. And I guess, frankly, if that's fine, but understand that there might be a consequence to that. And if that's something you can live with as an employer, you get to make those decisions. Sometimes I think that our unconscious bias about those decisions gets in the way of what really matters. Does it really matter that you have people in the office or not? Sometimes it does, but sometimes it really.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, you have to do what's going to work for your organization, but if you can do it through that lens of mitigating potential bias and making the decision, as Lori brought up, that it's really for the business and that's the best decision for the business, and feel good about that, then allow a degree of flexibility within that works. I think this last point, keep the playing field level. Make sure your managers are trained. You hear us say this ad nauseum on all of these calls, but it really matters. One of the things that this report did showcase is that, and this is no surprise, women in the workplace are most impacted by their immediate supervisor or the attention, the support that that person actually gives to them. So we have to make sure that managers across the board at all levels of an organization are trained on leading effectively in whatever workplace model they are playing in. And it might be multiple. It might switch from fully remote to hybrid. There might be sites that are fully on site. So managers have to be equipped with new sets of tools, resources, and techniques to ensure that they're doing these things that we're talking about, communicating flexibility options, gathering feedback regularly, having conversations about performance development, career pathing, options that, and then helping people achieve their professional development goals, supporting their professional development goals to the extent that they can, so that they are able to move in the direction that they're looking to move. We can't emphasize it enough. I do believe the rules have changed for managers, and I will suggest that it is a little bit harder. It takes a little more effort, a little more intention to be a manager in today's workplace, because it is different. So I think we have to be able to support the middle managers. That is the group. Actually, I should say managers at all levels, but managers at the senior managers, managing director, the director level managers are the ones that report the highest level of burnout and frustration right now as a result of the multiple demands that are being made on them. And it's such a critical role because they're the ones tasked with operationalizing, leadership strategy throughout the organization. So invest in them, take care of them, give them opportunities to learn and grow, and recalibrate with them regularly, just to make sure that they have what they need so that they're being effective managers of women, effective managers of everyone. Couple things you can think about. We talked about some of this, workplace models. Please make sure that you do some unconscious bias training with managers, and not just training, but help them think through, what does that look like? How might that show up when I'm interviewing? How might that show up in performance conversations? How might that show up when someone's asking me for a flexible work arrangement? And would I have the same response across the board for any individual who would ask me that? Think about allies for women in the workplace, right? As women, do you have allies in the workplace? Can you seek allies in the workplace? For men and women, are you being allies to women who seek to grow in the workplace? So it's important to think about what that looks like. An ally can do a little and can do a lot, but it can be the difference between somebody's voice being heard, somebody's ask being addressed. And it's important that we promote that. Helping people understand what allyship is and how they can be a part of it at any level of an organization matters. Continue to support DEIB and well-being in the workplace. I mean, this is something that showed up on the report consistently. Women leaders focus on well-being differently than men do, was a finding of the report, and that it's important to them. And then lastly, we just talked about the unconscious bias. But all of this to be said that, it really does take everyone in an organization to help stand up for everybody, right? But since this focuses on women, I love this Maya Angelou quote: each time a woman stands up for herself, she stands up for all women. And, I'm sure in your organizations, you're doing a great job of doing this, and continue that work. But continue to make efforts and celebrate those who really do help promote women and grow women leaders in your organization. I'd open it up for questions, or Lori, any further comments that you have about today's topic?
I have lots of thoughts on this. I've always, in my career, tried to advocate for women, and I think everybody wins. And the organizations that I've been affiliated with, whether because they were my clients or firms that I've worked with, have been richer, where they have challenged their ideas about, well, we've always done it this way. I've really seen them grow. Excuse
Bless
me.
you.
And really become really satisfying places to work. So, unrelated to that, I do want to do a quick commercial. I should have said in the beginning. We are starting a series at Fox, beginning on Thursday at noon, a webinar. It's a Fox Focus on Labor. And so Thursday program is a much more detailed discussion over all the things that came out of last week's conference, and it is targeted to both union employers and non-union employers, and with a discussion of trends in organizing that include, in particular, trends that we've seen in places that were not traditionally organized. I know you've heard me say this before, but nonprofits, smaller employers, the mom and pop shops, and then discussions about unfair labor practice charges and how that is kind of a new area for plaintiffs' lawyers to cultivate a new way of new fodder for their suits, and that's just the beginning of a really a 6-part series. The other, every 3 weeks, we'll have a different topic. The first topic, as I said, it's a 3-hour sort of everything you need to know, and then there'll be more advanced discussions after that. So if you're interested, feel free to go to the Fox website or give me, shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to. It's free, so I'm happy to help you get registered, and you can register for one or all 6, whatever works for you.
Great. I'll be signing up after this call. And one other kind of announcement. Tomorrow we launch our podcast called Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. Those of you who know me know that I've always said that's the book I'm going to write someday, but we turned it into a podcast instead because that's how all my conversations start. Lori, I'm sure yours do too. So please join us. We have 2 fabulous female leaders in human resources. From Integra Chain, a Philadelphia-based technology firm, and they're speaking about the actions that their organization has taken to support women in leadership roles and career pathing and mentorship, all kinds of things. They've really done some remarkable work. So look for that, tune in. And on behalf of myself and Lori, we thank you so much for spending your morning with us and hope that you found some little nugget of value in what we shared today. We will send a recording out of this, so please feel free to share with someone who wasn't able to attend. And we just want to thank you for listening and wish you well. Happy Women's History Month. All right, everybody.